Hey, what's up YouTube? My name is Brett and today we are going to go over route handlers inside of Next.js 13. So if you watched the video on route handlers, you probably just see most people do the GET request and the POST request. However, in this video, we are going to do the full CRUD operation, which is create, read, update, and delete, or it is a GET request, a POST request, a patch request, and a delete request. That is what we're going to do in this video. So before we get started, let me show you a demo of what we're going to create. So we have a Next.js 13 application here. And what we do in this application is we could create a book, we could update the book, we could delete the book, and we could get the list of all the books inside of the application. So let's create a new book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. We could put any publishing date we want. And then we'll press submit. Post was created successfully. And now, as you can see, we have Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and the book I typed out. Let's just go right over to my MongoDB database, refresh the page, and show you that it actually gets saved to a database as well. As you can see, here's the book as well. So now when we click the input box right here, we have the option to delete the book or edit the book. So we're going to test editing the book out. So now we could just do a new book title, and then we could do a new date. We could click submit, and it changes the book title here on the UI and also in the database. And then the last part of the CRUD application is the delete. So we click delete, and then it will delete the book, and it says no books to show. So this is a fully operating CRUD application that you can implement into many projects as you want. So before we get started, if you could hit that like button and also subscribe for more content like this, that would be greatly appreciated. Other than that, let's just jump right into the code. Okay, so let's go over the docs that relate to the route handlers. So the route handlers allows you to use the web request and response APIs. And a good thing to know is you can only use this inside of the app directory, which is what we're going to be using. And most people store their APIs inside of an API folder. So we're going to scroll down a little bit here. And the convention file for every API is either going to be route.js or TS, depending if you're using TypeScript or not. So as you can see here. And the supported HTTP methods include get, post, put, patch, delete, head, and options. So if you're using another method, you will get a response back of 4 or 5, method not allowed. Next.js also has a cool feature where you could extend the request and response APIs by using next request and next response to provide convenient helpers for advanced use cases. I always use next response regardless, and I know when you use TypeScript, you must use next response anyway. So if we scroll down more, as you can see, we're talking about caching, and route handlers are cached by default when using the get method with the response object. So what this means is that every time you do a GET request and you're using the response object, you're just going to be requesting data from the cache. And the way you could opt out of caching is by using a request object within the GET method, or using any of the HTTP methods as well, like the post request or the patch request. And as you scroll down throughout the docs, they give you a bunch of examples. They're pretty clear and cut of how you could use different HTTP methods inside of route handlers using Next.js 13. But rather than going through the docs like we are here, it would be better to actually code it and show you, because I feel like most people are visual learners and that would be the best way to learn. So let's get started with the code and create a Next.js 13 application. So we're just going to go quickly over how to create a new Next.js 13 application. I have my terminal open. We are going to go into wherever you want to keep all of your projects. So I'm going to cd into projects. And then the command for creating the new Next.js 13 application is npx create-next-app at latest. And then it will prompt you to a few questions you need to answer. What is your project name? We are going to name this book app. We are going to use TypeScript, so yes. ESLint, yes. Tailwind CSS, yes. The source directory, no. App router, yes. We'll leave the import alias as default, so no. And now it's going to initialize your project, install all the dependencies required based on your answers. This should take about 15 seconds. And then other than that, you have a boilerplate Next.js 13 application that now you could actually start coding. It's that simple. So let this take a little bit more time. When we do this, we are going to cd into the book app or whatever you called it. And we are going to press code dot. So now this is going to open up my VS Code editor right here, and we are ready to code. We are quickly going to clean up some files inside of this new Next.js project. First, I want to open up the dev server. So we're going to open up the terminal and press npm run dev, and it's going to open up a localhost 3000. I'm going to drag and drop it so it'll be half the screen, and then half the screen my code. So as you can see here, this is how your home page should look depending on the size of your screen. We could close the terminal again. We will open up the app directory. That is where most of the code is going to be. And then inside of the page.tsx, that is considered your home page. So I'm going to just press Alt-Z to wrap the code. And we are going to remove everything inside of the return. We want to get rid of it all. So we're going to get rid of it. And then this will disappear because that means we removed all the code that was associated with that. We are just going to put a div here. And then we will have an h1 that says homepage. Okay, now we have a few styles that you can see on the page, which is in the global CSS. We will remove lines 5 through 27. That will get rid of this style look here. And now we're on a blank page that says homepage. And the layout.tsx file is just wrapping the whole application. So if you need to put providers or wrap your whole application with anything, this is where you'll do it, and this is considered the root layout. Okay guys, so I know this is a route handlers tutorial video, but I feel like it's very important to go over every step. So we're gonna go quickly over Prism, which is the ORM connecting the database of MongoDB. So first off, let's set up Prism. So if you're not familiar with Prism, just follow these steps and you should get the hang of it. So we're gonna open up the terminal. And the first thing we need to do is we need to install a package. This will be the Prism package. And we are going to save this as a dev dependency. So npm I prism save dev. And if you want, you could check the package JSON to make sure it got installed correctly. And if we do, it shows up as a dev dependency there. Next thing we want to do is we want to invoke the Prism CLI. So to do that, we're going to say npx prism. And that is going to invoke Prism, and it's going to give you a bunch of instructions on other Prism methods and functions you can call inside of your terminal. Next thing we want to do is we want to initialize Prism. So to do this, it's going to be npx prism init, and this is going to do two main things. It is going to create a env file right here, and it's going to create a Prism folder with a schema.prism. So the next thing I am going to do is I am going to just edit the Prism schema file, and then we're going to create our MongoDB database. So to do that, we're going to go to our schema.prism, and the provider by default is good. It's going to be our Prism client.js, but the provider for our database is actually going to be MongoDB. So we're going to change this to MongoDB. And our database connection string is going to be inside of our env file under the database underscore URL. And if we check our env file, we have a default connection string here that we're going to replace with our own. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is I want to create a schema. So we're going to create a schema called book. And here is a quick tip. If you don't have like this blue and green color code here, you can actually go to your extensions tab over here, type in Prism, and you are going to install this extension onto your text editor, and that is what is going to allow you to add syntax highlighting, formatting, auto completion, and liting for Prism files. So that's why my code looks like that, and if you do that, yours will as well. So inside of our model book, we are going to define the variables that make up the book. So we need an ID, and the ID is going to have a unique identifier at the end of it. And this is specific to MongoDB. So the ID is going to have this decorator, but right after it is going to be considered a string, just like that. So that is going to be the ID of the book. And then we also need the title, which is a string, and we are going to have the date, which is a string. And obviously you could add a bunch more properties to this book, but these are going to be the ones for this tutorial purpose. Okay, so the next step we want to do is we actually want to connect our database to our ORM. So to do that, we are going to go on google.com. We're going to open up MongoDB. And you're going to go to mongodb.com. And you are going to sign in either with your Google account or a GitHub account or with an email. But I recommend either Google or GitHub. And then when you sign in, you are going to be on a page that looks like this. And I'm zoomed in a little bit. And we're going to go over here to our top left. We are going to create a new project, and we're going to have to name the project. The project we're going to name is going to be the book YouTube app. And then next, and we are not going to add any members or set permissions, so we're just going to click create project, and it is going to create our project. Now we need to also create our deployment. So we need to choose the cloud provider, the region, and our specs. So to do that, we're going to use the free tier, and this is for learning and exploring MongoDB in a cloud environment. And then obviously here is the rates of the serverless and the M10 database. We're going to use the provider of AWS. Click your recommended region with a star, and then you can leave your cluster name as is or create your own cluster name if you want. I'm going to click create, and I'm probably going to fail this. And I didn't. Nice. Okay. So now this is the most important part, is how you would like to authenticate your connection. And you have to create a username and password. So you could create whatever you want. I'm going to have this username as this. And the password, before you click create user, make sure you remember your password. So I'm going to copy my password, or you could add your own password if you want. I'm going to open up my notepad, and I'm going to paste my password right there, because we're going to need this for the connection string. We're going to click create user, and then it brings us to, we want to use a local environment or cloud environment. We're going to click local, and then you should be able to add your current IP address by clicking this button. It adds your IP address, and then we're going to click finish and close, and then we're just going to click go to overview. This should take a few seconds to maybe a few minutes to complete. After that is completed, we need to connect our database. So we're going to click connect. We're going to click MongoDB for VS Code, and we can skip right to step 3, which is the connection string. So we're going to copy the connection string right here. We're going to open up our text editor. We're going to go in our env file, and we're going to replace the default text string with our string right here. And the only thing is, you see where it says password with these brackets? We have to replace it with the password that we saved earlier. So in my notepad, I'm going to go copy this password and then paste it here. Perfect. And then one last thing to this connection string is we want to add a collection at the end that we want to save it to. So we want to save it to a books collection. You can name this collection whatever you want, but mine's going to be called books. If it's users, name it users. Just name it something that's related to what you're sending to your backend. Okay, now our connection to our backend should be complete. We will check it out when we test our post request. So we're going to close our env file, and then our schema.prism file is good to go too. And the next thing we want to do is we want to finish setting up our Prism. So we are going to open up our terminal, and the next thing we need to do is we need to ready the introspect, my fault. And to do that, we are going to say npx prism db pull. So this is going to pull everything inside of the database, and we are ready to go and make sure all of our schemas are ready to go. Next thing we want to do is we want to install the Prism client. So to do this, we could say npm I at prism-client. And this is going to allow us to connect to Prism and use the actual package for using different methods. So this is going to allow us to create, delete, just do a bunch of different things with the ORM connected to the database. And the last command I like running is npx prism generate, just to make sure all of our schemas are actually pushed to our database. Okay, so to check to make sure the schema is actually working and up and running, we could do npx prism studio. This will open up on localhost 5555. And if we bring it onto the screen, you will see our model of book. And we have no entries yet, but as you can see, our roles are ID, title, and date. So all of the variables we want passed into the backend look like they're ready to go. So what we could do here is we could just terminate the Prism Studio, and that means our Prism ORM and our database is ready to go to actually start working with route handlers. Now let's quickly go over the order we're going to use the route handlers for this specific project. We are going to use the post request, which is the create, and that'll be first because we need to create the book. Secondly, we're going to do a GET request, and that is going to get a list of all the books in our database to display on the UI. Third, we want to use the patch request, and this is going to allow us to edit the book title or date depending on if we made a mistake or we actually just want to change the book. And then the last route handler is the delete, and this is going to allow us to essentially delete the book in our database and our UI. So let's start with creating a new folder, and this folder is going to have parentheses just like this called site. This is going to help us organize all of our routes on the public side facing of our actual site. And to do that, next thing we need to do is we need to create a folder inside of site, and this is going to be called create-post. So this is going to create the first book, and then inside of that we need a page.tsx, which is the file convention. And then go back to your page.tsx, which is your root page. This is your home page. And I am just going to copy and paste some Tailwind CSS styles over to this page. And I'm also going to do it to more pages in the future of this video as well. And if you do want to be able to get this code, you can either pause the video, or I'm going to have the GitHub repository link in the description as well. So we're just going to copy this over. Let's import link from next/link, and this is going to be our home page. We're going to have a link going to the create post page, which is this page we just created. So now for the create post page, let's actually start coding it out. So the first thing I want to do is I want to mark this as a use client, because we are using the use state hook and the use router hook, which requires us to make this a client side page. So we can import those two first. At the top, we'll have the use state, and this is going to store the state from the form inputs. So that'll be the title and the date. And then the second, we're going to use the use router hook because we want to be able to push to the actual books page, and this is going to come from next/navigation, just like that. So we're going to create a function called create post. This is going to be an arrow function, and let's export it at the bottom just like this. So inside, let's create the return, which is just the JSX, and most of this JSX on this page is actually just going to be a bunch of Tailwind CSS styles in the form. So I am going to copy a bunch of this code over and explain what's going on. And let's wrap this around. So right over here, we have a parent div with some Tailwind CSS styles, as you can see here. We have an H1 that says create new book. And then we have a form right below that. And in that form, we have two labels labeling the inputs, and there's also two inputs. The inputs allow the user to type in the title of the book they want and also the date of the book they want. So as you can see here, the value is going to be title, the value is going to be date, and then when they type, the on change is going to set the title function to the e.target.value, which is going to update the value. And that's going to do the same thing for the date input as well. And then right below the two inputs, we have a button, and that button is inside of the form, as you can see. And that button is going to essentially, let me zoom back out again. What that button is going to do is it's going to essentially pretty much trigger this on submit. And this on submit is a handle post creation function, which we haven't created yet. So we're going to update the states real quick, and the handle post creation, we're going to write that function as well, because that is what is going to allow us to connect to the API backend. So what we want to do is we want to store the state of the inputs. So we want to store the state in the title and the date, just like that. And the initial values are going to be empty strings. Let's also initialize the router by putting inside of the router variable. And then let's do an arrow function to the handle post creation. And we are getting a squiggly for the E, and that's because we are using TypeScript. This is the event. So let's just paste the type here, which is a React.form event, HTML form event. And then what I want to do here in this code block is actually start coding out the connection to the backend API. So first off, I want to do a check. So we're going to say if there's no title, if there's no title or there is no date, we want to return an alert that's going to say, please fill in all fields. So if they click the button and they didn't type in the title or date by accident, they're going to get this alert. Next, we want to prevent the default of what happens on the form. So we don't want it to refresh. We're going to say event.prevent default. Next, we want to store the response in a response variable. And we are going to use the fetch API. And make sure you use an asynchronous function with the await keyword in front of fetch. And then we are going to fetch to our backend API. So it's going to be in /API /create-post. Just like that. And then we need to specify a few things. So the method is going to be post because we're creating. We need headers. And what we're going to send back is we're going to send back some JSON data. And then we need to send the body back, and we need to stringify the title and date, just like that. Okay, so that's pretty much all the code we can actually do in the front end before we can actually start pretty much doing anything else, because we need to actually work on the back end. So to work on the back end, we need to create an API route that is consistent with this right here. So to do that, inside of the app folder, we're going to have an API folder. And inside of that API folder, we're going to have another folder called create-post. And then we're going to have a file convention of route.ts. Okay, so now we could actually start coding our backend API for our post requests. So what we're going to do is we're going to import next response, and this is from next/server. And then we're going to also import the Prism client because we need to use the ORM to send this data back to the database. So we need to initialize Prism, and we're going to store it inside of a Prism variable. Then next, let's start creating the function. So this is going to be an async function, and it's going to be a post request. It's going to take in the request from the front end, and is going to be considered a request object. And then let's do our code block. So the first thing inside of a post request is we usually take in some data, and in this case is just going to be a string. So it's going to be const body equals await, and then it's request.json. And then if you want to make sure you're getting the body back, which is the title and date, you can actually console.log the body. And then we also want to destructure the body as well. So it's going to be title and date, and it's going to equal the body. So we could actually run this code and see if we're actually sending our title and date back to our API route. So to do that, let's do npm run dev. Let's open up localhost 3000. And on our home page, you see this as the style. We're going to click create new book. And this is all Tailwind CSS here in the front end. And what we're going to do here is we're going to create a book title. We're just going to say testing. And then we're going to do 1 to 21. We're going to click submit, and nothing's going to happen because we haven't finished our code yet. So we're going to make sure we actually got it back. And since we are console logging it here in a server file and component, it should be consoled in our server. And as you can see down here, our title is testing and our date is 1/2/21. So we are actually receiving the data from the front end to the back end. So the next thing we want to do is we want to save the book to the database, just like that. So that's a comment. So what we do here is we're going to say const, we're going to store it in a post variable, and it's going to await the prism.book, which is the model we created, .create, and it's going to iterate through an object that's going to have a data object, and we're going to pass the title and the date. And then let's close that data object off. And as you can see here, this is how we create a specific book inside of our database, inside of the book model. And the ID is just going to populate automatically. That's why we're not passing it back here. It automatically populates for MongoDB. So the next thing we want to do is we want to return a next response.json, and inside of this we can return the post with a status of 201. So let's try it out again, and when we try this out again too, it's also going to test our database. So let's do an actual book, rich dad poor dad, and let's do some random date. Click submit. Nothing happens. So let's check our database real quick. We could refresh this page right here. We could browse the collection. And as you can see here, we have the book I just entered with an ID and a date. So our database is working. Our post request is working as well. And let's just add some stuff to the front end to make it more user friendly, to see if they actually made the request to actually create a book legit. So inside of the create post on the UI side, after we send the body, we want to make sure if the response is okay. If the response is okay, let's run this code. And what we want to do is we want to alert that the post was created successfully. And then we also want to set the fields of the title and date back to an empty string. So we're going to say set title, it's going to be empty string, and then set date is going to be empty string as well. And then let's just have an else, because just in case it fails, else something went wrong when creating a book. And then we also are going to push it to a different page. So we could just do that real quick. So we're going to do router.push, and it's going to be to a books page, which we haven't created yet, but let's create it now so we don't get an error. So inside of the site folder, let's create another folder called books. And inside of that, we need a file convention called page.tsx. We could just run an RAFCE. We could call this the books page, remove the import at the top. And now we have the books page. So let's go back to our localhost 3000, refresh the page. Let's call this Harry Potter 1/5/21. We'll click submit. We get an alert that says post created successfully, and it pushed us to our books page. And let's just check our database again to make sure everything is working. And as you can see, we have Rich Dad, Poor Dad, and we also have Harry Potter 1 in our database. So we have successfully created a post request, which is the first of the CRUD, which is create. Now we are going to create, we're going to create a GET request, which is going to be the read, which is the second part of the CRUD application. So we are going to go back and we are going to use this books page to list all of the books in order. So the first thing we're going to do on the books page to list all of our books, we're going to mark this as a use client. Reason why is because we're going to use the use state and use effect hook, and it must be a client component. and this is coming from React. And we're also going to use the use router hook as well. And that's from next/navigation. Okay, next thing I want to do is I do want to create an interface real quick because we want to define the types for this book. So what we're going to have is we're going to have an ID, which is a string. We're going to have a title, which is a string, a date, which is a string, and then we're also going to have one more thing, which is going to be a checked, and it's going to be a Boolean. So this is if it's checked or not. So if it's true or false. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to start copying some Tailwind CSS styles over so I don't have to write them out. So on the parent div, let me copy this style over. So we have that style right here. And then right below that, we want an H1 that says the books list with a few styles as well. Just like that. Let me close this terminal. There we go. Okay. So the next thing we want to do is we want to be able to fetch the books when we land on this page. So the very first thing we need to do is we need to set up a use effect. So to do that, let's do that right above the return inside of the function. So we're going to just put a comment saying get all books. So we're going to have a use effect. In the use effect, we are going to store it in a response, and we're going to await the fetch. And then we have to create this API endpoint again because this is going to be a GET request. So we're going to just say API and then books, just like that. And then we don't have to define the method because it is just a GET request. So what we have to do next is just we're going to say const data equals the response.json. And what we need to do here, since we're using the await keyword, we do need to actually make this whole thing a asynchronous function. And you don't want to make an asynchronous function on the parent layer of the use effect. So for example, you're going to have to say const get books equals an async function just like this. We're going to cover like that and then cover like that, just like that. So we have a function inside of the use effect called getBooks. It uses an async arrow function, which allows us to fetch data from the books API endpoint. So then two, we want a console log just to make sure we are getting all the books. So that's going to be stored in the data variable. And then we want to make sure when we get the books, we set it to a specific state. So let's create some state up here called books and set books. And this is going to be an interface of this book, and it's going to be an array of them. And then the initial value is going to be an empty array, just like that. And what we are going to do here is we're going to say, we're going to set the books to the data, which is the books we're going to get from the API endpoint. And it's going to be stored now in the books variable. So before we continue, let's actually create this endpoint API in the backend real quick. So to do that, we are going to create a new folder API, and we're going to call this books. And then inside of it, we're going to have a route.ts file. Okay. So what we are going to do here is let's import the next response from next/server. And then let's also import Prism client from app_prism/client. Let's initialize Prism inside of a Prism variable. We're going to export the async function of get. And what we could do here is we're going to have a request object because we don't want to cache the data. If you cache data inside of a GET request, you're going to just be doing a GET request to the same data. So if you do update your book, you're not going to be able to get the updated books inside of your books list. So you do have to pass the request object inside of the get print API endpoint. So let's just do a comment. We're going to get all books from database. And it is very simple. It's a few lines of code. So if that. So we're going to put the books inside of a books variable, and we're going to use the prism.book.findMany. And find many is just going to find all the books inside of this model called book. And that's our only model we have anyway. And then all we're going to do is we are going to return a next response.json. We're going to return the books with a status of 200. So what we could do here is we could check our network tab when we land on the books page. And if we do have a book created, which we do have two, we should be able to see those books inside of our network tab. So let's go back to our application. Let's open up our DevTools, make this bigger. Let's go to our network tab. Let's refresh this page. And we have, let's just make sure all the code is right. Nope. Let's go back to our text editor. Let's go to our books page. And we are running this use effect when the page initially loads. And this is calling API/books. We're doing a return a next response.json. And we're fetching it when the page loads on the initial load. Okay. So it looks like everything should work. So let's test it out again. Oh, the only thing we didn't do and why it's not going to work is because it's saying right here, as you can see, it's not highlighted. Get books is declared, but its value is never read. So in the cleanup function of the use effect, we have to initialize this function by saying get books with the initializer. So that's why it probably wasn't working. So let's test that again. Okay, so let's open up the DevTools, go to the network tab, refresh the page. And as you can see here, we do have a books request with a fetch. So that's probably ours. We have a 200 request, which means successful. And as you can see the preview, we do get 2 books with the ID, a title of Rich Dad Poor Dad, and a title of Harry Potter 1 with dates. So we are getting the books now to our front end. So that means this allows us to map through the books and actually list them. So that is what we needed to do for this page. So that's how you use and create the GET requests inside of Next.js 13. That is a very simple example, but all the GET request does is obviously get information from a database or a backend. So now let's actually finish coding the rest so we can display the books on this page. So to do that, let's have a unordered list here at the bottom. So we're going to have a UL just like that. And inside of the unordered list, we are going to map through all the books. So the very first thing I want to do is I want to do a check. So we're going to say books.length. If that length is equal to 0, then we're going to say no books to show. And then if not, we're just going to map through all the books. So I'm just going to copy this real quick so I don't have to write all of it out. We're going to paste that. Let me copy some styles as well from the unordered list. Paste that there. And so if we have a book's length of 0, which means we have no books, we're just going to display a p tag saying no books to show. Next, we want to map through all of the books. So we're going to do a books.map. And what we're going to do here is we need to actually define what the book is. So the book is going to be a book interface because we defined it up here. And then we also need the index. And we're going to need the index so we can decide which check input box is actually check. And that's going to be a number. So it's going to start from 0 and go all the way up to however many books there are. So other than that, I am just going to copy the rest of the code in there so I don't have to write it all out. And then I'll explain everything that's kind of going on. Okay, so like I said, we're mapping through the books, and we're mapping through the book, which is an interface of book, and the index, which is the number, and that's going to be typed as a number. We're going to have a div with some Tailwind CSS classes. We're also going to have an input, which is going to be a checkbox. And this is going to allow us to check to see which book we're actually clicking on. And this is going to allow us to either edit or delete that specific book based on the index, which, like I said, starts at 0. If it's the first book, 1 will be the second book, and so on. The next, we want the first listed item to be our book title, and then the second one will be the book date. And then you have to have a key, which is going to be our book.id, which is our unique identifier of the specific book. Next, we're going to have 2 buttons. One is going to be for our handle delete, and then the other one is going to be for our handle edit. And as you can see, we have some Tailwind classes, and then we also have disabled properties. So if the book is not checked, it is disabled. And then we also have an onClick, which calls the handle delete and handle edit function. And then we also have an onClick on the checkbox, which is called the handle check. And we're passing in the index, which is the number associated with the specific book in the list. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create the handle check function. So const handle check, it's going to be an arrow function, and it's taking in the index because we're passing it in through here. And that is going to be a number, right? Next, let's close this code block so we don't forget. And we are going to say const, and it's going to be our updated books. And we're just going to iterate through all the books inside of an array because it is an array of books. Next, we are going to take the updated books index, so it could be 0, and dot checked, so that means true or false. And it's not going to equal the other checked ones. So this is going to allow us to only check one input box and not all of them. Because if you don't do this step and you try an input box without having a handle check, when you click one input box, they're all going to be selected. And when you deselect one, they're all going to be deselected. So this is why you have this. And then let's set the books to the updated books. Perfect. So that is going to handle our check functionality, which is right here for the input box of checkbox. And now, before we continue, let's just comment this out, comment that out, and we have no errors now. So let's actually check and see how our application is working and looking. So as you can see here, we do have our books list with Rich Dad Poor Dad and Harry Potter 1. So now we have successfully used a create API, and we've also used the get request API as well. So now the next thing I want to do is I want to add a few more things below this so we can actually go back to the page. So I am just going to copy another div with a button. And all this is going to do is going to take us back to the page to create a new book if we need to. And let's initialize the router. So const router to the use router hook. Okay. So as you can see, we just go back to the page, go to books, create a new book. And if we create a new book, let's call this the new. We could say 3 2 3 3 2 23. Submit. Post created successfully. Takes us back to the page, and as you can see, our new book is ready and to use on our books list. And that is because the use effect always runs when this page gets loaded on the initial load. Okay, so the next thing we are going to work on is the patch API route. So the patch API route allows us to edit and this is the update part of the CRUD functionality. I know lots of tutorials don't show you kind of how to do this. They just go over the first two that I really went over. But I know people want to be able to use the edit, and the delete is pretty simple as well. So to do the edits and delete, these need to be dynamic routes because we need to only edit or delete one of our books. So we need to make sure we're editing and deleting the right book. So to do that, let's go back to our books page with all of the books. And the first thing I want to do inside of the books page is we want to finish the handle edit function. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to uncomment this right here. And this is going to handle the edit, and we're passing in the book. So all the properties of the book. So right underneath the handle check, let's do a const handle edit. And what we're going to do is we're just going to pass in the book, like I said. And then inside of this code right here, we're just going to push them to a different page because we need to have another page so we could actually have more inputs to change the actual values of the specific book. So we're going to use the router.push. And what we're going to do is we're going to have the template literals. And it's going to go to /books/edit. And then we need to pass in some parameters. So we're going to have a question mark. The ID is going to equal the book.id. So that is going to be the specific unique identifier to actually see what book we actually want to edit. So it's going to push to that specific page. So the next thing we need to do is we need to create that specific page. So that's inside the books, and inside of that we could create another folder called edit, just like that. And inside of the edit, we could have a page.tsx. So we are going to have this as a use client page. Let's import the use router hook and the use search-params hook. And they come from the same package, which is next/navigation. So we're using the use search-params hook, and this allows us to get specific values from a URL. So I'm going to show you exactly how to use that. And let's import use effect and use state as well. So let's do const edit page as the function, as an arrow function. We're going to export the edit page just like that. And the very first things we need to do is let's actually get the parameters from that URL. So we're going to initialize the search params, and we're going to store it inside of a search params variable just like that. Next thing we are going to do is we are going to specifically get the ID. The reason why we are getting the ID is because if we go back to our books page, we named it as ID, which equals the book ID. So we are going to do right here, we're going to just call this book ID. You can name this whatever you want. Equals the search params dot get, and it's going to get the ID. And then if you want, we can console .log the book ID. And this is going to be inside of the console of the client side. So let's do that real quick. So what we are going to do is we are going to open up this console real quick. Okay. We're going to click one. And as you can see, it only is associated with one of the books. So wherever book we click, it opens up those two buttons. So we're going to click Harry Potter, and let's click Edit Book. When we click Edit Book, you can see in the URL up here, it has an ID, which is the MongoDB ID inside of the database. And then we also console log the book ID, and as you can see here, it is the same ID that is here. So we're actually successfully getting the ID from that specific book, which allows us to edit that book or delete the book. So let's close this out. let's just go back to our books list, just like this. And let's start working more inside of the edit page. So now that we know this console is working for the book ID, next thing I want to do is I want to start storing some state. So we want to change the title and the date of the specific book. So right above this, I usually like putting it right below the beginning of the function. We're going to have the title and set title again, and the date and set date. Another thing I want to do is I want to show what the name of the book is, the title, and the date as well before you start editing it, just to make sure the user knows what book they're editing. So to do that, we're going to have the book and set book, and we are going to set that. I want to set it to undefined at first because it might be undefined. And then what I'm going to have here is we need to have an interface as well, or a type. So we're going to have an interface called book props. And what we're going to have here is we're going to have a title, which will be a string, and date, which will be a string as well. And then for this, because we're going to get a type error layer if we don't do this, we're going to call this book props, or it's going to be undefined. So it's just like that, because our initial value is going to be undefined, so we need this or as undefined. Next thing I want to do is, before we forget, is initialize the use router. So I spaced it out a little bit just so we know. Now we have our search params here. And the next thing we need to do is we need to have a use effect. And this use effect is going to grab the book that we specifically pushed to this page so we could display it to the user. So we need to grab the book. So the thing we are going to do is we're going to say const get book is going to equal an asynchronous arrow function, just like this. Inside of this, we'll have a response equal to await the fetch web API. This is going to be a template literal /API /books, and then we're just getting the book ID because that's what we stored in here. So we need the book ID as this, like that. Next, we will store the response inside of a data variable. We will set the book to the data, which is the book. And then if you want, you can console.log the book. And then we can console log the data here if you want, just to make sure the data is the right thing we're putting inside the set book. And then we need a cleanup function for this as well. So for this, we have to, like we said, I almost forgot in the last step, we have to initialize the get book. But to do this, I only want to initialize the get book if there is a book ID. So if there's a book ID, we're going to initialize the get book. Other than that, we're going to only run this use effect when the book ID changes, and that is when the page loads. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is we need to actually create this backend fetch here for this API. So to do that, inside of our books, we need, this is inside of the API folder, we have the books. We need to create another folder inside of the books, and this needs to be with the bracket notation. And the reason why is because this is going to be a dynamic route. So this route is always going to take in a new ID, and that's why you need those brackets. And inside of the bracket folder, we're going to have a route.ts. So let me just try to explain this a little better so you kind of understand. So inside of the edit page, we are doing a use effect, and we are trying to fetch this specific book. So that's the reason why we can't use the same GET request we did earlier, is because it's fetching all the books. So this one is still going to fetch a specific book. So now let's actually start coding that backend API route so we can fetch the specific book, which is inside of this dynamic ID in brackets inside of the route.ts. So we're going to do the same thing, import the next response from next /server. And then we're also going to import the Prism client and then invoke Prism client as well. We're going to have a GET request in here and a patch request inside of this specific route.ts file. First thing we want is we want the GET because we need to get the book and we want to display it to the user. So it's going to be a request just like that because it is not caching any data. And what we are going to do here is we need to accept a few parameters, and the parameter is going to be the ID. So whatever you name this, you can name this book ID. The parameter will be book ID. So what we're going to do here is we're going to put a comma. We're going to have the parameters inside of an object, and then the parameters, we're going to define the type, which that is it right there, but let me just type it out. So the parameters is going to be the ID, which is a string, just like that. Perfect. So that is going to allow us to take in the parameter of ID, which is the ID in the URL, and pass it to this backend to get that specific book. So what we're going to do is let's destructure the ID from the params just like that. And the next thing we want to do is we want to get the book with the given ID from the database. So we're going to store it in a book variable just like that because it's a singular book. We're going to await the prism.book.find unique. And what we're going to do in here is we are going to run where the ID equals the ID, just like that, which is the parameter here. So we are finding the book where the ID equals the ID, which is the MongoDB ID. And what we're going to do here is we are going to return a next response.json, and we're going to return the book with a status of 200. So now we're going to be able to retrieve the book from our database and display that specific book on our edit page. So if we go back to our edit page, so it's inside of books/edit and then the page.tsx file. What we're going to do here is we are going to now be able to put the return down here. And then like I've been doing, I am just going to copy this because it is a lot of Tailwind CSS. So let me just copy all this and explain what's going on. Okay, perfect. Okay, so what we have here is we have a parent div with a bunch of Tailwind CSS classes. We have an H1 that says we're going to edit the book info of, and it is going to be the book. And so if the book is true, it is going to show the book title and book date. If it's not true, if there is no book yet and it's still waiting, we're going to show a p tag of loading. So the reason why we have book is because we are setting the book to the book value here. And this data is the response from this API point we just made to get that specific book. So that is why we're able to say if the book is true, we're showing the book title and the book date. And so after we show the book title and book date up here, we're going to have a form. And this form is going to allow us to actually edit the new title and new date for our book. And so it's like the same thing as the post request. We have a form with the two inputs, an onChange and the value set up in the inputs. And then we have a button which says submit. And when this button is clicked, it is going to trigger this onSubmit with this handle edit function. And then all we have to do down here is we have to import link from next/link. And this is going to take us back to all of our books page down here below the form. So next thing I want to do is I want to create this handle edit function, which is right here. So whenever somebody clicks on to edit the book, it'll fire this handle edit function. So const handle edit function is going to take in the event. And what we could do here too, we could say if there's no title or date, we're going to say please fill in all the fields. because you can't submit and edit if these aren't filled out. Okay, so next thing we want to do is we want to do the event.prevent default. So prevent the default of what a form does. Then we want to do a response, and this is going to be a wait and then a fetch. And this fetch, we're going to have a template literal, and we have to create this specific function inside of that same route file. So we're going to do API books, and it'll be the book ID. And then what we're going to do here is we have to pass in the method. So the method we're going to say is going to be a patch. So we're going to do the patch, or you could do put. Same thing. It's going to update your specific book. Next is we need to pass what type we're passing back, which is going to be content type of application /JSON. And then we need to pass in the new body, which is the title and date. We just typed it on the form down below. Then after that, we are going to retrieve the data from that response. So we could just say const data equals the response.json. We could console log the data just to make sure we have it. And then what we can do here is we could do if the response is okay, we could say alert book edited successfully. And then also we can router.push back to our books list page, which is /books. But now we actually need to create this API endpoint for the specific patch method. We have an error somewhere. Let me just make sure everything's closed, which it isn't. So something's not closed up, one of my brackets. So let me just copy this whole thing in real quick. And now everything's closed up. So let me just do if response is okay. We're going to have brackets like this. This alert's going to go inside if the response was okay, saying the book was updated successful. And then we'll have a router.push as well. And that's going to go to the books. Okay, so like I said, let's create this backend API endpoint of books. This is going to be inside of the books dynamic ID route and the route.ts. So we already did the GET request to a specific book. Next thing we want to do is we want to export an async function, and this function, like I said, is going to be a patch. So we're going to have a patch. It's going to be request. We're taking in the request, and it is a request object. And then we need a comma, and then we need to take in the params because we need to know which book we are editing. So the params is going to be params and then ID of string, just like that. Let's get our code block up here. And let's destructure the params real quick, which is going to be ID. And that's going to equal your params. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to destructure what we're receiving from the body. So let's just destructure right off the bat, title and date, just like that. And then it's going to wait the request.json. And like I said, you could console log this like we did in the previous step of the post request, but that should be fine right enough. Next thing we want to do is we want to update the book with the given ID from the database. So now we want to update the database with what we updated here in the code. So we're going to store it in a book. We're going to wait the prism.book update. And then inside of the book update, we need to find the book that matches the ID. So ID is going to be the ID that we pass in. And then we need to pass in the new data. So the new data of the title and date that we get from the request.json. And that is how it looks exactly there. And if you want, you could just put title like that, and then date like that. I kind of like that way a little better. I know it's repetitive, but I just like it better. And then right below this, we're going to return the next response.json with the book and a status of 200. So that should be it for the patch request. Let's go back to the front end of it on the edit page. And let's just make sure everything is complete on this front end page. And it looks like everything is pretty complete on this page. So we could test it out to make sure everything's working and make sure the edit's working. So let's go back to our localhost 3000, refresh the page, make sure we have no errors. Cool. So let's click rich.pordad. We'll click edit book. And as you can see, I had a loading state of loading, and then it said edit book info of rich.pordad with the date. That is that GET request to that singular book. And as you can see, the ID is up here. Okay. So now let's actually see if this form works and edits this book information on our UI, and if it edits our book information in our database. So we're just going to call this testing, and then we could call this 2, 3, 12. We're going to click submit. Book updated successfully, and it updated our rich.pordad book to testing and a new date. So let's see if it actually updated in our database. So we should not have the rich.pordad anymore. We should have testing. And as you can see, we have testing right there. And we have all 3 of our books still in our list. And they all 3 pop up here. So we have successfully coded a patch request, which allows us to edit in our database and on the UI of our application. Okay, and the last of the CRUD operations, which is D, and it stands for delete. So we're going to use the route handler delete inside of Next.js 13 to delete a specific book. This is a lot easier than the edit, which is the update, or the patch or put API route handler, and that's because you have to create a whole new form, and it's just more steps to complete the route. The delete, we could do this all within side of the books page, but we do need to create another backend API route. So inside of the books page, which lists all of our books, I commented out this on click for the delete button. So we're going to uncomment this, and we have a handle delete function passing in the book. And the book is a book type, which has the ID, the title, the date, and the checked properties inside of the book. So now let's create a handle delete. So we're going to create a handle delete function, which is taking in the book. And what we are going to do here is let's have a try catch block. Okay. So in the try block, we are going to have a response, and this is going to be to a backend backend API route, which we haven't created yet. And this backend API route is going to be a template literal because it is dynamic. So we need to pass in dynamic data. It's going to be API and then delete book. And then we're going to pass in the book ID. Just like that. And now we need to be specific of which method we are using. The method we're using is the delete method. And that is all we need to pass in to our response. So what we need to do here is we just could do the const data equals the response.json. Then we could console log all of the data to make sure everything is good. And then what we need to do here is we need to filter the books. So we're going to say if the response is okay. So that means if the delete went okay. We are going to say alert book deleted successfully. And then we also need to filter all of the books again because we need to remove that book from the list. So we're going to set our books to books.filter, which is a higher order function. And we are going to pass in the book which is a book type. And then what we're going to do here is we're going to have an arrow function. So we're going to have the book.id. And as long as it doesn't equal the data.id, which is the book we actually deleted, then we could actually set all of these books back onto our books page and list them all out. So it's just going to take away the book that we actually deleted. That is what this filter higher order function does. And another thing that is very key is if you don't add this next line of code, your page, you would have to refresh the page to see if your book actually got deleted. So what you're going to do here is you're going to have a window.location.reload. This will automatically reload your page after all of this code is called. So you're going to have your alert, which is book is deleted successfully. It's going to set your books, and then it's going to reload your page. And then what we can do down here is we could just do a console log of error. Okay, so this is the front end handle delete function. Now we need to create this API endpoint back here. So inside of our API folder, we need another folder called delete-book, and then it'll be a route.ts file. Okay, so inside of the delete book API route, we need to make sure, actually before even doing this route, let's delete this real quick. And inside the delete book, we need another folder because it is dynamic of ID. And this is going to be in brackets as well. And then we create the route.ts file. And you only have the brackets is when your data is dynamic, like either editing or deleting. So import next response from next/server. And then import the Prism client from @Prism client and then initialize it as well. And then what we're going to do here, export async function. This is going to be the delete function, delete API. And what we're going to do here is we have to pass in the request, which is a request object, and then the params. And the params here is set up the same way. And for this, I'm just going to do Annie because technically it could be any type. You don't want any type anyway, so you would want to fix that in the future, but this isn't a TypeScript course or a tutorial. This is more of route handlers. So we're going to destructure the ID, which is going to equal the params. And then we are just going to delete the book with the given ID from the database. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say const book equals await prism dot book, which is the model, and then we're using the delete prism function. And what we're going to do here is we are going to delete where the ID is the ID that we passed in. So whatever ID equals the ID we passed in, that is the book we want to delete. And then all we're going to do here is return a next response.json with, instead of the book, because there's going to be no more book, we're going to just say deleted with the status of 200. And we need a comma here. Perfect. Okay, so now let's test everything out and make sure our whole application is working. So let's refresh the page. And when we click, say, testing, click delete, book deleted successfully, refreshes the page, and then now our book is deleted. And if we come back, our testing book should not be in our database anymore either. And as you can see, we only have 2 books, Harry Potter 1 and the new. So that is exactly how you do the whole CRUD operations, which is create, read, update, and delete. That's how you use 4 different route handlers inside of Next.js 13. And if you do have any questions, leave them in the comments. I know this video is pretty long. And like I said, everything will be timestamped below, so you can skip to spots you want to skip to, or you could skip parts that you don't want to see. But other than that, thank you for staying to the end of the video. I hope you learned a lot. And if you did, hit that like button, and also subscribe for more content just like this.